Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Classic, forgot to unmute there, but for those who are here, I hope you had a lovely lunch. And welcome to our afternoon session, all about nature-based solutions at a catchment scale. This theme has already been kind of hinted at quite a lot in this morning's discussions for those of you who were there. So I guess it's just a chance to reiterate that although we've kind of divided the agenda of this conference into four neat-ish different themes, the whole point of it is that it's all integrated and nothing exists in a complete vacuum. There's no one problem, there's no one solution to all of this, and there's no one sort of party or person who I guess is responsible for sorting it out. Hopefully people are coming back in from their lunch now, but I don't want to delay this afternoon's proceedings too much as we've got another busy schedule ahead. So I'm going to hand over to our technical director, Dave Johnson, who's going to introduce the first session of this afternoon. Cheers, Dave.
Thanks, Becca. Welcome back, everybody, and I'll be chairing this session. And I'd like to start by introducing Professor Liz Bentley, who is CEO of the Royal Meteorological Society, which is a learned professional body with a mission to advance the understanding of weather and climate. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Liz. Thanks.
Great, thank you. I'm just going to share my screen and make sure you can see that. Great, thanks very much for the invitation to come and present to you today and join this panel discussion. I hope you're having a good conference. So yes, I'm Professor Liz Bentley. I've been a meteorologist for nearly 30 years now. Half of my career was at the Met Office. I've also run the BBC Weather Centre for a few years, worked in government before joining the Royal Meteorological Society. And as Dave said, the Royal Met Society is the learned and professional body for weather and climate. So we don't do any weather forecasting or any research into meteorology here, but we facilitate things that support people and organisations that work within meteorology. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes just taking you through some of the climate challenges, focus on the UK, I guess, but we will look at other places as well. And I've entitled this UK Rainfall, Famine and Feast, and you'll see why as I think we go through the next few slides. So this is an image which many of you will remember from last summer. This is July last year, and this is a Woodhead Reservoir, which is in the Peak District. Very familiar picture of different parts of the UK, different parts of Europe as well, as we were basically going through a drought, a lack of rainfall for months on end. So a familiar picture. And if we look back at 2022 as a whole, it was a particularly dry year. So on the left-hand side, you can see the rainfall that was received during the whole year of 2022 as a percentage of what we would normally expect in a typical year. And the browns basically emphasise where there were below average amounts of rainfall. And pretty much the whole of the UK had below average rainfall, with, I guess, East Anglia probably faring the worst if you look across the different regions. On the right-hand side of this slide, you'll see July itself, which was a particularly dry month. And again, the southern part of the UK, particularly as you get towards the south and east, were particularly affected during that period. But it was a hot year, and I think many people will remember 2022 because of the record-breaking temperatures that we had in July as well, 40 degrees plus. Recorded in many places across the UK. A significant heat wave affected us, and that heat obviously exacerbated the lack of rainfall, so we got more evaporation of any moisture that was left in the ground. So it really did cause further problems to the dry conditions that we had. The year as a whole came out as being warmer, drier and sunnier than average, and I'll take you through some other examples, more recent examples of the beginning of this year as well. But I did want to then just focus on the reservoir levels. So this graph on the left-hand side shows the July reservoir levels from 1990 on the left through to 2023. And you can see 2023 was the lowest stock levels within our reservoirs across England and Wales that we've seen in the last 30 years or so. So it was a particularly severe drought that we were in. And as such, we had hosepipe bans, and you can see the map on the right-hand side showing the various hosepipe bans that were put in place by water companies at the end of last summer. In fact, if you were watching the news this morning, you'll see that in the southwest, the hosepipe bans are going to stay in place for Devon as we go into this summer as well, as the concerns are still there. And the drought obviously caused problems from the amount of lack of water in reservoirs and rivers, but led to a number of wildfires. So we had a particularly severe wildfire season here in the UK. We did get them from time to time, but we had 500 more wildfires reported in 2022 than compared to the previous year. And they were happening very close to urban areas as well, not just on rural land. And obviously, this lack of rainfall during the summer put a lot of stress on the trees, and that led to what we call a false autumn. So the trees turned brown in August, and those leaves were falling to the ground quite readily. So lack of, not to do with a change in the amount of sunshine, but to do with the stress that the trees were going through because of the lack of rainfall. So called false autumn happening much earlier than it normally would do. Towards the end of August, though, then the shower clouds came and the rain began to fall. And the problem that we had was that the ground was so dry that that rain wasn't able to penetrate into the ground. So I've just got a short video here that I'd like to share with you. There's no sound on this, I'm just going to talk over. But this was an experiment done at the University of Reading. Rob Thompson, who's at the University of Reading. This was done in the same gardens at the university campus on the same day, and on the left-hand side was a piece of grass that was next to the flower bed, so it was well watered and the grass was quite wet. In the middle is away from the flower beds. It got a little bit of water, but we maybe class as a typical summer, so some of the grass has started to die, but there's still some life left in the grass. And on the right-hand side is the parched grass that many of us saw last summer, and effectively after that kind of drought and heat wave of lack of rainfall for months on end. And you'll see that on the left-hand side, the water in the cup has already penetrated into the wet grass. In the middle, it's penetrating, reasonably nicely into the grass, but on the right-hand side, there's absolutely no penetration really of that water from the cup into the ground. And this was the problem that we had at the end of this drought period in the UK. When we got the heavy rain, it couldn't soak into the ground and it just ran off and caused flash flooding events. And here are two images taken in London in August last year after those heavy rainfall events, as I say, falling on very dry ground, not able to penetrate into the ground or into the sewer systems. The picture on the right came from a video that went viral. So this is just outside King's Cross Station in London. And people thought that the gentleman on the right-hand side of the image was trying to brush the water away from his property to save his property. But actually, he was trying to unblock the drain because a lot of those leaves that had fallen from the false autumn had blocked the drain, and he was trying to clear the drain to let that water go away. But these are the consequences, I think, of seeing more extreme rainfall events, but after a long drought period. And as we go into 2023, well, we've seen kind of similar conditions. So February was a very dry month, one of the driest that we've seen in decades, back to 1993. And on the left, you can see the lack of rain falling pretty much across the whole of the UK, but again, the severity in the southern half of the UK. And then in March, we had the opposite. So we had a significant amount of rain, again, particularly across the southern half of the UK. It was the 6th wettest March for the UK as a whole. And the rainfall records go back to the early 1800s. And some parts of the UK, particularly across southern half, saw twice as much rain falling than they would in a typical March. So this famine and feast that I mentioned at the beginning, the title of this talk, you can see this starting to play out now in our climate. Our climate is changing. And if we look at the rainfall amounts going back through that series, so these are annual rainfall amounts with the years on the horizontal axis going back to the early 1800s through to present day on the right-hand side, and those amounts shown, those annual amounts shown on the vertical axis. And you can see this variation from year to year. That line goes up and down. There's quite a lot of variation. But if I take your eye to the black dashed line, you can see that actually, although it moves up and down, there is a general trend upwards as we go through the series, particularly as you look at the last 3 or 4 decades. There's been an increase in the average rainfall that we get in the UK. We've also seen an increase in the number of extreme rainfall events. So this shows the occurrence of a rain gauge recording more than 200 millimetres of rainfall in any particular day, a 24-hour period. And you classed 200 millimetres or more in a day, that leads to flooding events. It's an extreme rainfall event. Prior to 2000, you'll see that there have only been 3 events where that happened. Since 2000, we've had 17 days where that's happened. So you can see that we are shifting from having more days that we get these extreme downpours of rainfall. And that's really due to the fact that as our climate warms, a warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. Typically 1 degree of warming, and in the UK we've probably seen about 1.2 degrees Celsius of warming since pre-industrial levels, but 1 degree of warming leads to about 7% increase in the amount of moisture. So there's more moisture in the atmosphere, and therefore when we get these rainfall events, we get much more intense downpours of rain coming from these rain clouds. If we look ahead at climate projections, so looking into the future, what are the climate models telling us? There's some images here of how temperature may change as we go forwards into the kind of second half of the century. These are based on high emission scenarios. So basically we keep our emissions of greenhouse gases similar to what we have at the moment. So we don't do any sort of action or policy changes to get us to net zero. You can see temperatures are rising between about 5 to 7 degrees if you look at the right hand image on here by about 2070. But the overall message, if you include temperature and rainfall, is that we are projecting warmer, wetter winters and hotter, drier summers. And actually, if you look back over the last kind of 100 years or so, we're seeing increasing rainfall both in summer and winter. But last year was probably the first year where we've seen that trend change to a hotter, drier summer than we normally would anticipate. So I think scientists have often now referring to 2022 to be effectively, the future, how the future might look if we look back at last year in particular. I'll talk about the climate projections because they are really useful mechanisms for looking at future projections. And again, more than happy to pick this up in the panel discussion if people are interested in how they can access future projections going forward. But it gives us lots of information. So it not only tells us about temperature, but it also tells us we're going to see an increase in the intensity and frequency of storms, heavier rainfall events, as I've already mentioned, an increase in the intensity of summer rainfall events. These heavy extreme events are likely to become more frequent, leading to obviously flooding events, but also a decrease in soil moisture. And that might not sit alongside each other, but effectively we're going to get drier summers. We're going to get rain events in the summer, and they're going to fall at very intense rainfall events. But overall, averagely over the whole 3 months of summer, June, July and August, we're going to see less rainfall. So it'll come in the form of very quick bursts that probably will run off very quickly, rather than slower bursts that we can kind of make use of and store in the ground. So lots of changes already seen in the UK, but also as we go forward looking decades ahead. And really, just to finish, I just wanted to highlight the Environment Agency report that was published a few years ago, 2020, looking at the water resources in the UK. And there's a statement that I just wanted to pull out of here that says the amount of water available in England, obviously from the Environment Agency, the focus is England, could be reduced by 10 to 15%, with some rivers seeing up to an 80% increase during those summer months. So I think, just to summarise, on the whole, I think as the UK, we're probably going to get enough rainfall across the whole of the UK in a typical average year. It's just going to come either too much all at once or too little. And so we're just going to have to learn really to start to adapt to that. That was it from me, Dave.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Liz. That was really thought-provoking and slightly scary at the same time. I'd like to start this panel session by introducing the other 2 members of the panel. So we've got Alex Fraser from Mott MacDonald and Ben Fitzsimmons from Water Resources East. with Alex with a specialty in natural flood management and Ben on water resources. So I wanted to start with with a fairly simple question to Liz, which was, you talked about the changes that climate change is going to bring in terms of the hydrological, specifically in terms of the water balance. What's the key thing? We've got warmer, wetter winters, but does that mean we've got more water available in the winter or less in the summer? How's it going to sort of work out overall, do you think?
Yeah, so as I say, the projections will say warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers. So the increase in the amount of rainfall that we expect during those winter months is going to go up. And the amount of rainfall that we see in the summer will go down. But as I said in the presentation, although the overall rainfall in the summer will go down, we still will get these intense summer convective downpours. And almost too much rain falling in a very short space of time for us to really do anything with. So that's the trend. And last year probably was the first time we've seen that kind of trend playing out in the UK. Previous to that, we've seen rainfall increasing during our summer months, typically year on year. There's also a variation spatially, which I think is quite interesting. So I think over the course of a 12-month period, we probably will have enough rainfall falling into our kind of catchment areas. It's just how we manage that so we can store it when we get the rain and we can use it when there's been a lack of rain. And also in the UK, we typically find the west of the UK is wetter than the east, and that's probably going to stay the same as we move forward with our changing climate. So we need to think about how we can move water that's fallen in certain parts of say, the western half of the UK to the drier half of the eastern half of the UK. So it's about storing it for times when we've got a deficit and maybe even thinking about transferring it around to different parts of the country as well.
Brilliant, and thank you very much. So that's much clearer in my head. I like a nice simple picture in my head so I know what to think. And the second question to you, really, before I move on to the rest of the panel, are there any positive signs in terms of climate change? I'm talking globally, and if not, where would we look first to see anything?
Yeah, if you look at climate projections, unfortunately, that it isn't a positive message. Typically, globally, places that are already wet are likely to get wetter, and places that are dry are likely to become dry. I mean, that's fairly broad brush, but it does sit quite nicely across that headline story. We have these climate targets to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and again, many of the targets are not going to be met, both in the UK, but I don't think there's any country in the world that is going to meet its current targets that it's set. So that doesn't paint a great picture regarding mitigation of climate change. There was a survey done, though, by the Met Office with a focus on the UK in particular, but looking at our perceptions of climate change here in the UK. And this was done about a few weeks ago. The survey was announced a few weeks ago, so fairly recent. And that said that about 60% of us in the UK are consciously making decisions to move to a low carbon lifestyle. So 60% of us, nearly 2/3, are already making those decisions. Again, 65%, so again, 2/3, are trying to do things individually to make those changes. Sometimes they don't know what to do or which things have the biggest impact. They're definitely trying to make those decisions. And about 3/4 of us are already aware of climate change and the fact that it's linked to extreme weather, and seeing that extreme weather kind of playing out in front of our eyes here in the UK. So we no longer need to convince people that climate change is happening. It's about what can we do to kind of educate them to make those informed decisions, to make those changes.
Brilliant. Thanks very much. Well, I'm going to ask the next question to Alex and Ben. I was very taken a couple of weeks ago. I was listening to a radio program about Texas, and they said that the expression in Texas is whiskey is for talking and water is for fighting. And it really kind of brought it home to me. The water is #1 risk on the World Economic Forum risk register. So first to you, Ben, what does climate change mean in terms of, drought and water resources from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks, David. Well, from my perspective, at Water Resources East, where we're dealing with a regional scale water resources challenge in the east of England, which includes East Anglia down to the Thames Estuary and up to the South Humber Bank, which is, as Liz has said, is the driest part of the country. And what we're recognising really through the regional planning process, which is a multi-sector one, is that we're going to have to make some really, really tough decisions. And at the moment, we're kind of constrained within the regulatory framework that we exist and the licenses, the water abstraction permits that individual businesses, our water supply companies have. But in the future, under climate change, with the pressure that Liz has outlined, we're going to have to really be faced with some tough decisions. Do we want to give water to agriculture? Do we want to give water to public water supply? Do we want to give water to businesses? That's all the way up the supply chain, right the way up to energy supply. Or do we want to leave more water in the environment to protect our really important ecosystems? And these are things that are just going to become intensified as we move through the coming decades. And I think it's completely right. What we saw last year was really an eye-opener for a lot of people. And it's really starting to pose those questions right now. This isn't something for the future. This is something that businesses in the east of England in particular, where I can speak most about, are genuinely facing tough decisions this year because of what happened last year and what they fear might happen. So I think there's a real opportunity for catchment groups through the catchment-based approach, with the support of regional groups like ours, the Environment Agency and others, to really start to tackle some of these big questions, to figure out, what's the right allocation of resources in light of the environment that we want to see in the future.
Thanks, Ben. And a similar question to you, Alex. I mean, what does it mean in terms of flooding, and is there much in terms of a regional difference in risk, or is the risk more in urban or rural areas? What's your sort of feel for how the pattern of flooding is going to change?
I think there's going to be a really interesting change in how we sort of observe flood risk, and I think the points that and the video that Professor Bentley showed about the rainfall runoff response is going to be sort of, if there's a way of showing it visually, that's the change that we're going to see. We're not going to see a gradual sort of change between our different hydrological seasons. We're going to see this more rapid, more sort of flashy flow regime in a lot of our catchments, which is going to mean that we need to plan and prepare to sort of achieve hydrological readiness. We need to have readiness both for excesses of water and the deficiencies of water, because that deficiency is going to impact when we have the excesses as well. It's not just a case of we need to build a thing for one particular source of an event, a flood. We need to prepare for the whole cycle. I think there's going to be a real interest around our rivers and how that area is going to respond. If we've got far lower flows within our channels, what's that actually going to do to the flood defence assets that are in place? Because they have been built with a reliance of a wet bed or a degree of water at sort of Q95, and if that Q95 is changing, what's that going to do to those assets and to those structures? Are we going to see a lot of that sort of ground shrinkage in and around the river itself that we've observed on a lot of our flat agricultural lands? And I think the other interesting sort of location to sort of observe is the rural areas, particularly those that are near our coasts. This sort of climate change is, and the talks have been focused around the hydrological responses, but actually with sea level rise, there's going to be a real impact on how those coastal watercourses respond to hydrology as well, which I think is going to be sort of the most interesting area. Interesting being a quite scientific way of something that's really quite a challenge for society.
Yeah, absolutely. And can I ask a supplementary question of you, Alex? That I've seen a prediction of a 55% increase in surface water flows into our sewage treatment works, effectively due to this kind of very high sort of runoff. Does that seem like is that a realistic picture of what we could be seeing?
I think that sort of number in isolation seems a quite scary and almost unrealistic number. But when we consider the amount of permitted development and what you're allowed to do on a property, the increase in the urban creep and the sort of move from a green with, I can't use the word green because of artificial grass now. The move from a grass, a natural front and back and side garden, to essentially an increased impermeable area, that 55% to me feels very, very real, if not perhaps slightly optimistic, given the impacts of climate change and the aridness that we're going to see in our properties. I said my garden was picked pretty hard last year, and it's going to be even worse with, let's say, future hydrological responses.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, I agree. So this one is specifically for Liz. So does climate change, I mean, I think your talk very clearly said it does mean increased intensity events, and you showed that video clip, which all of us are going to be using from here on, I can see. But you know, what could that mean for water quality in terms of the kind of the energy that the rainfall's allowed to actually apply into the soil?
Yeah, so again, when you get these heavy rainfall events, obviously it's strong enough to kind of take the topsoil away. And I guess it really then starts to think about how we look after the land. So if there's bare soil in those heavy rainfall events, then you're going to get soil erosion. You're going to get a lot of that, you know, being taken into the rivers. Whereas if there's crops or there's trees planted in the soil and the soil health is actually quite good, then the soil can act as a natural flood management system. You know, things like peatlands as well are also really good for managing. If they're well preserved and looked after, they capture that rainfall, they slow the flow into the rivers. So we do need to think a little bit more about land use, land management, not just for kind of food support, but also when we're thinking about flood management as well. But you know, again, you know, we use our land to grow crops, and there's going to be certain times of the year when we've harvested and those fields are bare. If you get those heavy rainfall events, however well you've managed the land, if it happens when the crops aren't there, you're going to get soil erosion. It's inevitable.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you. I think I've got one more question that I'm going to do before I throw it open to all the questions that I can see coming into the chat. And this one's specifically for Ben. So evapotranspiration is, you know, a very large proportion of the water balance. And so, you know, we're being encouraged to plant a lot of trees, and you know, and obviously there are changes in land use in terms of cropping. Have you got any observations on, you know, how we should be using our land in the future in terms of crops to with the impact of evapotranspiration?
It's a tough question. Thanks for that one, David. I think my general answer is going to be catchment location specific. Nature-based solutions, tree planting could be one of those. Has to be very much done in consideration of what the catchment's hydrology is, what its soils are, what its connection to the river network is, and the groundwater underneath. There are cases where planting could actually reduce infiltration to soils and then our aquifers to support base flows in rivers and support water available for use later on. But absolutely, if trees are being planted with a view to slow the flows and increase infiltration, but at the same time potentially in conjunction with other land use changes reduce evapotranspiration, well then that, as you say, that's a potential huge benefit to our catchments and our water resources challenge. Now the problem we've got is actually calculating what those benefits or disbenefits might be, and a lot of investment in the UK and around the world has to be kind of based typically on, okay, if I'm going to invest an amount of money, what's my return on that investment going to be, either in, you know, actual money coming back or reduced spend on some other services that the environment or a grey infrastructure asset might provide. And so I think there's a risk that we can get ourselves tied up in knots around that. I need to calculate the exact evapotranspiration reduction as a result of this nature-based solution or whatever it might be. But I think we need to also focus on the other multiple benefits of these kinds of things, not get hung up on one single thing. We're doing those kind of things, tree planting, land use changes, are often done with multiple reasons in mind. So we need to make sure we're taking a really broad view of what the benefits could be in any given locality.
Yeah, Graham, thank you. And I just saw a comment coming in there saying that the, you know, land management practices also have a huge impact as well. Graham, well, those are my privileges done. Those are my questions that I wanted to ask, and I'll throw it open now to the floor. And Becca, should I ask the questions in sort of from the top to start at the top?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so really interesting talk, Liz. Despite this, though, in a recent Ofwat survey, it highlighted by Water for Tomorrow, only 6% of responders showed an awareness both of scarcity and excess, despite their lived experience. What advice or suggestion do you have for the way we talk about weather and its relationship to rivers as we go into another drought?
Yeah, I agree with that, actually. I mean, again, the Met Office survey that I shared, and it's one survey there, you know, my own experience going out is that although there is a growing interest in people who want to live a more sustainable life, there are still, you know, questions about, well, what can I do, both from mitigation perspective, so reducing their greenhouse gases, but also about how they can adapt. So if I start with mitigation, and I'll try and keep this as brief as I can, but typically an average person in the UK has a carbon footprint of about 10 tonnes of carbon a year. Most of us recycle and think that we're doing a really good job in kind of reducing our carbon footprint, but that accounts for about 0.1 tonne of carbon per year recycling. So it's a really small part of our carbon footprint. It's still important to do. The big things that will reduce your carbon footprint are around transportation, so moving away from diesel and petrol cars to electric, or becoming car free and just walking and cycling if that's an option for you. Flying less, you don't have to stop flying, but one long haul flight, return flight, say to the US a year, saves about 2 tonnes of carbon per person. It's a huge impact. You can think about how you change the kind of food you eat, and it's not just about kind of moving from a meat diet to a vegetarian, but thinking about where you source your food, how you cook your food, less food waste. All of these things add to a carbon footprint. So there's some fundamental things that have a much bigger impact on your carbon footprint than, say, just recycling, which again is important but isn't going to reduce your carbon footprint. But people aren't aware of that, and it's that education of what is it that will make a difference to us as individuals, to our businesses, and to the country as a whole. So I think it's about getting that. That's mitigation. And adaptation is key, because, you know, again, our climate is changing. We have to adapt, and we have to do an education program so that people are prepared for the next heat wave, for the next drought, for the next floods. So, you know, it's all about all the things that we can do. If you're thinking about flooding, how do you prepare yourself should a severe flood warning come into force where you live, so that you can evacuate your house, keep yourself safe, you know, preserve as many valuables that you have in the house. It's having that plan in place so you can make those quick decisions. If it's heat related, again, Public Health England and NHS do, you know, some good work in trying to get messages out about how to keep ourselves cool. We in the UK, we're very bad with heat. You know, the sun comes out, the temperature goes up. We fling the windows and doors open, and we invite all of that heat into our buildings. If you look at our friends on the Mediterranean, they shut everything in. They shut the windows and the shutters. They darken their building during the daytime. We've just got to change the way we adapt to kind of live with these things. And the same with drought. Again, you know, most of us will have some sort of water butt in the garden, which has probably been fine for the last few decades to kind of manage the water when we have it and use it when we don't. But we're going to have to do more of that, and probably even change the things that we grow in the UK. So there's a whole raft of things, whether it's mitigation or adaptation, that's needed.
Thank you very much for that. The next question is very close to my own heart, and I promise I did not upvote this one. How do we measure soil moisture? So does anyone on the panel want to take that? Any takers for that?
I mean, I guess it depends on where it's being asked from. You know, there are field tests where you can actually measure the content of soil in a particular specific location. But in addition to that, if it's referring to kind of these national, regional, global views of soil moisture content, that's typically gained through remote sensing and satellite technology. So it depends, but there are real examples on the ground where farmers measure soil moisture on a daily, hourly basis to optimize irrigation approaches. So it is actually a physical thing that you can measure on the ground in a particular field.
Absolutely. Did anyone have anything else? While I was going to throw over, Alex, did you have anything?
Yeah, it depends on, I suppose, it depends exactly upon what you're trying to get out of that soil moisture test. For me, there's the simple thing of digging a hole and rubbing it through your fingers is as useful as a really long, detailed scientific investigation. You can tell what the soil's doing through that much quicker, much more readily than, let's say, using an infiltrometer, using a series of the 3-ring systems, or an actual soil moisture probe. All of these things are fantastic ways of giving you a number, which you can usually eyeball, going, yeah, that's a bit too moist, that's a bit too dry, and get a feel for it that way. And that actually getting to know your soils from digging a hole, looking at the structure as well as the soil moisture, I would advocate to absolutely anyone. Dig a hole and take a look is my usual answer to life.
I couldn't agree with you more. We've recently given this challenge to a group of students at Birmingham City University to design a soil health monitor, and it's really interesting how many of them went for really high-tech solutions when you could dig a hole and look at the structure. Brilliant. Okay, thank you both for that. Next one is, to what extent do you think beavers would be able to minimise the famine and feast dynamic, given their ability to store significant amounts of water and reduce it slowly during the drier months? And I'm kind of, yeah, for beavers, let's read anything that stores water and releases it as well. So beavers specifically, but then anything that's storing water. Anyone want to take that one?
I'll dive in on that one. I absolutely support any measure that moves towards the hydrological readiness that we need for our catchment. Beavers are a part of that solution, the part of the natural ecosystem of the UK. They also do need stuff that kills them as well, to be totally honest. And I'm not talking an angry farmer with a shotgun or a gamekeeper. I'm talking it needs predators as well to be part of that system. Beavers are a really good sort of tool within the toolkit, but I think when we start to accept beavers and their introduction, that'll be symptomatic of a far wider sort of societal and land use change that I think is more the answer. Not having every square foot of land to productivity, because that's what we're seeing. Like I said, a lot of the big areas that we could see improved, our upland moors, our hilltops, that's not going to really change by the introduction of beavers. That's going to be stopping the usual culprits of people wanting to go and shoot things. That's part of it. We don't have to ban everything, but we have to manage it better and be far more sensitive with the use of our land.
Okay, thank you. And I can see that Ben, you've come off mute, so.
Yeah, I was just going to speak from a kind of water resources and low flows perspective, I guess. Yeah, there have been really, really good examples where beavers or other approaches, as you say, David, that slow water in the environment have had really great local impacts. Again, this is an interesting one because there's different effects that this can have from a water resource perspective. You know, are beavers in any given catchment acting in one part of the catchment going to prevent a water company being to issue a hosepipe ban? Probably not. You know, the water companies build very, very large reservoirs, which is effectively what the beavers are doing at a small scale to offset that. And they operate on their kind of asset control curves. They'll be looking at those strategic reservoirs and how they reduce over time. But what these kind of slow in the flow approaches can do is provide greater resilience locally and greater resilience to the environment as well. So when we talk about droughts, it's not just about whether we as householders can water our plants in the garden from the hose pipe or not, or go and wash our cars. It's around how other sectors like farming need water, and how water quality is affecting their access to water. So can these options reduce turbidity in the rivers that actually allows them to gain greater access to water while it's there? But also from an environmental perspective, when we talk about droughts developing and then recovering, all of these local schemes that slow the flow of water in our catchments can both delay the onset of environmental impacts as a drought develops, but also speed up recovery. You know, those areas where the beavers are acting might create refuges for wildlife during those periods that then can allow it to bounce back after droughts happen. So I think we need to think in the round. It's not just about impacts on us of drought and these kind of high intensity events, but also around how we lead into these events and how we recover from these events as a society and within our habitats that surround us as well.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I really wanted to, I know you've done a bit of work on this, Ben, was I mean, farmers want to store water too. I mean, it came top of their list of things to do. So there's quite a drive in the farming community. Is that not the case?
There are, and there's really good examples. Yeah, exactly. So at a very small scale and from an environmental perspective, yeah, beavers and other things can store water, but farmers can build individual reservoirs. They can share reservoir storage and optimize that. Water companies can build large strategic reservoirs. But there are really good examples that look at how water moves around the catchment. So I think, as Liz said, there's probably enough water there. We just haven't figured out how to capture it and use it in the most appropriate way. And there's a couple of really good examples around the UK where water is being either held back in catchments or brought back into the catchments before it's allowed to go out to sea. So we've got lots of areas of our land in the east of England that are drained, physically drained by pumps and control structures, a legacy of hundreds of years of farming and draining of land. And if that water, that kind of pool of assets and bodies that manage them can work better to hold more water in our freshwater catchments before it's going out, maybe put that into use to restore peatland, to supply drainage ditches and small rivers with the water they need, or provide farmers with the water they need to store when it's available in surplus and then allow it to go at another time. I think there's a lot of really good examples of that.
Thank you. And I think this will probably be our last question. And I'm going to probably put it to everybody, but I'll start off with Liz. So Liz's talk was very interesting. Here comes the but it feels like there are major considerations around transferring waters around the country. Can we feel comfortable about decisions and projects being developed, perhaps without the inclusion of local interest and decision processes?
Yeah, so a really interesting one. So I remember back in the drought we had in 2012, there was some serious discussions about opening the kind of river and canal network to try and move water west to east. So how do we connect, say, the Thames to the Severn with canal systems that kind of are there, but probably just they all need reconnecting? Massive project. But, you know, if you could get that in place, then clearly you start to solve some problems. But since then, we've had droughts and water has been moved. It's been moved in tankers around the country. And that has happened. You know, parts of, I don't know, Yorkshire might get more rainfall and they, you know, fill up the tankers from the reservoirs there and move them south. It's just very expensive to do. That's the problem. So there have been some working examples that haven't had a great deal of impact on kind of, you know, local communities by, you know, massive infrastructure, but it's just very expensive either way.
Thank you. And Alex, do you think in terms of moving water around, is there any mileage in that for flooding, or is this really moving water around is really a water resource issue, not a flooding one?
I think the scale we'll need for flood alleviation is going to be quite astronomical, and you're going to be talking building structures several times their planned size to move the amount of water we need for flood risk purposes. But I think the interesting opportunity, I think, sits in where we've got those areas where we're going to transfer water from, and those surplus areas, is what new storage infrastructure, collection infrastructure can we get in those locations, and can we look at that delivering the flood risk benefit we need? I said that everything other than water moves around the country quite easily, power, etc. Water's the next on the list. I think having a national water management strategy and plan that does work on moving water around the country will probably shine a positive light onto the fact that water's a resource and not a nuisance, and hopefully we'll stop just drain it being the default solution.
Thanks, Alex. And I know I'm almost up in time, so I was just going to give the last word to you, Ben, because I'm sure that that must be a consideration in your neck of the woods.
Yeah, it's a huge consideration for us and nationally. Yeah, I mean, I could probably speak for 2 hours just on this, but there is a process right now looking at the benefits and costs of transferring water over large distances between regions. So the Grand Union Canal is being talked about as bringing water down to the southeast. Anglian Water, for example, are already building a pipe from kind of the north of their area in Lincolnshire down into the East Anglia patch. But yeah, you'll see in the news stories written from both sides. You'll read an article that says, why aren't we bringing water from an area where there's a surplus to an area where there's a deficit? Well, it just makes sense. Why aren't we doing it? And then the completely reasonable counter to that is, well, but have we fully assessed the carbon impacts of pumping that water? Have we considered the differences in water quality and what the impacts of bringing that water from one catchment to another? Is it going to introduce invasive species? So there's lots and lots to consider. The process that we're involved in nationally is trying to unpick all those difficult things. But no, if anyone's interested in more, if you Google strategic resource options in the UK, you'll find out a lot about large-scale reservoirs and large-scale transfers and how they're being considered in the round.
Brilliant. Well, that's a really good way to round off. Thank you everyone on the panel for answering my questions, then everybody else's. And I think we're probably at time, are we, Becca?
Perfect timing. Thanks, Dave. And thanks everyone else as well. That was really enjoyable and insightful. And I think personally, I'm really going to remember that just little pithy phrase of water is a resource, not a nuisance. Really, really nice phrasing there from Alex. So yes, thank you everyone. And also a lot of these themes I think will be picked up in the session at 3:30, our panel discussion on working with farmers and landowners. But for now, I am just going to call in our Strategy and Stewardship Director, Amina Abubakar, who's going to translate this back to, I guess, the Rivers Trust and talk about our ambition for nature-based solutions. So hopefully the stage is set for you, Amina, to go into your presentation. And thanks again, everyone from that panel.
Thank you, Becca. Am I sharing my screen?
Not yet.
Okay.
Looks like that just coming now.
Slide mode. Hi everyone, thank you for the introduction, Becca. So I'm going to talk to you about building up on some of the things we heard in our really interesting panel on how we can maximize opportunities to deliver landscape resilience, and particularly around nature-based solutions, and recognizing that there are some barriers around scale and adoption, wider adoption of some of these solutions, and what can we do to enable solutions to come forward and remove some of those barriers. And again, going back to the previous panel, it's not about being to set the scene again, because when it comes to the current state of our water environment, we're up against some serious challenges with growing pressures around too much water, too little water, too dirty water, pollution, weather extremes exacerbated by climate change and biodiversity crisis, the population growth, urbanization, putting pressure on water demand and water security, but also aging infrastructure and lack of much more coordinated and large-scale investment. And around this point of lack of investment, a recent study published by the Green Finance Institute shows that we need to address a £56 billion gap in financing in the next 10 years if we are to revert the decline we're seeing in the UK nature and be able to address the challenges around our food systems and our natural systems and leverage much more funding for greater environmental gains and drive an integrated response to achieving net zero targets, but also to provide benefits and resilience to local communities and to the economy. And these are too many problems for us to solve them separately. Addressing them effectively requires new and more collaborative ways of working, And we desperately need targeted actions if we are to build that resilience around our rivers and freshwater environment and leave them in a much better state. Nature-based solutions, or NBS for short, can play a critical role in addressing not only the multiple challenges faced by the water environment and provide that much more targeted action, but it can also help to address other societal problems, from carbon emissions to biodiversity decline, all at the same time. And what I mean in the context of nature-based solutions includes your traditional natural solutions, but also catchment-wide solutions and hybrids, things around integrating natural features with engineered solutions, such as, for example, sustainable drainage systems, SUDs, or integrated constructed wetlands. And this umbrella of solutions is maximized in their value when they are delivering a multifunctional purpose, whereby one nature-based solution can deliver multiple improvements at the same time, for water quality, biodiversity improvements, but also flood reduction. And therefore, they can provide a multitude of benefits from a social, environmental, and economic perspective. They're also maximized when they're integrated with engineered solutions, which then helps to optimize the synergies and the trade-offs with traditional infrastructure, reduces impact on carbon-intensive measures, just rounding up the last question that Dave asked around water transferring across the country. But it also provides much more integrated solutions that are not just cost-effective, but also provide much more resilience. And they are better when they're driven through collaboration in planning and delivery, and much more coordination at landscape scale, when they're incentivized to multiple investment opportunities and to joined up funding. Because by aggregating their diverse benefits and functions and really understanding and quantifying the benefits of what we're trying to deliver, nature-based solutions can actually become quite an attractive proposition to decision makers and investors alike. So what's there not to like? There's lots of benefits that we can deliver to address the challenges we talked about. However, the scale of uptake is quite slow and the investment is really not ramping up. And what's actually preventing this scale? Well, there's lots of barriers preventing the wider uptake of nature-based solutions. There are limited standardizations, for example, around methods, systems, and processes for how we design and implement nature-based solutions, for how we assess and quantify their value and benefits, and for how we maintain and monitor their effectiveness in reducing some of these risks. There's limited knowledge transfer, which tends to happen quite ad hocly in terms of expertise sharing, limited to localized practitioners and case studies and academics. So we need to do a lot more around broadening and sharing information. There's also the fact that investment and delivery of nature-based solutions remains hugely fragmented across landscapes, with people, organizations still continue to work in silos and not really being fully aligned in terms of risk sharing, in terms of planning, investment, implementation, or prioritization, which then in turn creates competing pressures, particularly around land and ownership, which reinforces uncertainty, some risk aversion, and lack of trust, which then precludes investment and this sort of wider uptake of nature-based solutions. Policy and regulation can also restrict and be conflicting in terms of enabling opportunities to come forward. And of course, we are seeing limited incentives and financial resources, with lack of clarity and transparency around what's in it for me from a beneficiary's perspective. We need stronger business cases that strengthen the case around cost reduction, resilience of landscapes and infrastructure, but also the value added that nature-based solutions, multiple benefits can provide. So in many ways, these barriers are sort of working together to widen the perception that nature-based solutions are high-risk alternatives against tried and tested engineered technologies, which prevents that greater adoption and the mainstreaming of these solutions, and therefore hinders the greater value that could be realized for society and the environment. So we need to do more in enabling and removing these barriers by creating better local and national collaboration to partnership working across multiple organizations, stakeholders, disciplines, communities. By working with cross-sectoral partners across the country, governmental bodies and policymakers, we need to advocate for change and for more supportive regulation and policy, and use supportive regulation and policy to demonstrate how nature-based solutions can be incentivized. We need to develop more joined up and collaborative approaches to investment, planning, delivery, and assessment of value, particularly encouraging standardization of tools, systems, and processes, so that we can expedite action and build confidence and trust in nature-based solutions. And more importantly, I think we need to share more broadly. We need to disseminate lessons learned, knowledge, best practice, innovation, better ways of working, training, etc. We need to really raise the awareness of how these solutions can help us to tackle some of the serious challenges our water environment is facing. As part of the Rivers Trust movement, we're already doing quite a lot in this space. With our diverse experience in catchment-based approach, our movement plays many roles in this enabling space. We're often in prime position to be able to connect the dots across the landscape, and we're involved in multiple aspects of driving transformation and change and implementation of nature-based solutions, particularly through local delivery, which is the staple diet and the very core part of our movement. And this means not just delivering solutions, but also involving and convening different stakeholders to enable that change to take place. So in many ways, we're not just practitioners of catchment-based approach, we're also practitioners of bringing people together and brokering relationships, which is really important if we are going to see the transformation we want to see. The diversity of projects and experiences across the movement means that we are constantly innovating, brokering solutions and sharing knowledge, such as, for example, the work we're doing around piloting and enabling investment through market-led approaches. We're constantly demonstrating new ways of working, promoting initiatives that drive better value for our communities and for our rivers and nature. And I'll give you an example of some of these solutions and opportunities that we're working across the movement. This is one of the proposals we submitted to the Ofwat Innovation Fund recently, which is about mainstreaming nature-based solutions to deliver greater value. We brought together a partnership of 22 organizations through our strategic partnership with United Utilities. And through this competition, we're asking for funds to accelerate landscape transformation by removing barriers and maximizing the value of nature-based solutions across the UK. And we want to deliver a 5-year program where we address these multiple needs at landscape scale. And we already have momentum. We've got commitment from these 22 organizations and others who want to work with us on this. And this innovation fund will help to kickstart this transformation. So I'll give you an overview of the outputs we're expecting to deliver, such as, for example, a common value framework for assessing the value and the socioeconomic and environmental impact of nature-based solutions using consistent approaches. Working with regulators and policymakers to pull together tried and tested recommendations that can enable nature-based solutions. Building a multi-million-pound investable pipeline of opportunities, which we're hoping to create through real-life projects on the ground and through a short to long-term investment and delivery plan. And bringing together as well tools and processes and knowledge resources that can facilitate and expedite dissemination, widespread expertise, and standardization of best practice approaches, so that we can start to accelerate that long-term landscape transformation. But we do a lot of other work that isn't this strategic, like, for example, creating market-led projects. And I've just got a snapshot of some of the projects we're working on, like the Leeds FMR, which builds on the success we delivered in the Northwest through the Wye and Natural Flood Management Project to develop long-term revenue streams for the delivery of the Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme to a natural flood management program, or creating innovative combined solutions that bring nature-based solutions and technology together, like what we're doing in Windermere, developing a low-cost solution for tackling nutrient reduction and pollution that comes from decentralized wastewater systems like septic tanks, which we've got a lot of in Windermere, and creating wider adoption and deployment of this solution to commercialization and market approaches. Through delivering a lot of projects to the Natural Environment Investment Readiness Fund, which was launched by DEFRA and the EA, like the Eden Catchment Market, where we're working with partners to create demand-led investment to deliver nature-based solutions across the catchment in the next 5 years, £15 million that can be leveraged to that. And there's many other of these examples around the NERF funds that we're delivering across the country, working with our movement and working with other partners to really build investment-ready opportunities for nature-based solutions. And later you'll hear from Dan Turner after the break, who will tell us more about the NERF funding, but also deep dive on the Resilient Glenderamackin project, which is allowing multiple beneficiaries to collectively pay back a significant upfront investments to private investment over time and within their institution constraints, really building on what we've already done in the Wire project, which is not far from Glenderamackin. So these are some of the things that we're working on across the movement, but much more remains to be done, and with much more collaboration needs to come to the fore to become the new norm. We need to create new networks, more inclusive partnerships and governance approaches, fostering collaboration on a wider scale between different parts of society, and accelerate the uptake of nature-based solutions. We need to support development and piloting of opportunities such as our market-led approaches, but also business and investment models, addressing the lack of systematic support and identifying and foster new ideas, and grow a selection of nature-based solutions friendly business models and mechanisms so that we can start to provide blueprints and for scale and replication. We need to create the right incentives, advocating for critical reforms and change in policy and regulation, as well as in markets and through the creation of these new business opportunities. There's also a need to do much more around integrating funding and blending funding sources to make nature-based solutions much more attractive in terms of investment and financial sustainability. And we need to level the playing field. The impact of nature-based solutions relative to business as usual practices is hindered by many uncertainties, by a lack of transparency. New tools, standardized systems and assessments with consistent metrics and quantification methodologies are much needed to allow stakeholders to see the change, to relate to the tangible benefits, and to build evidence and confidence for increased investment in nature-based solutions. And as I said before, we need to learn and we need to share best practice. There's a need to draw on a range of disciplines and expertise to help drive solutions at scale. The skill gaps around technical, financial, and delivery resources needs to be plugged. We need to create opportunities for effective knowledge sharing about governance, technical design, business and financial models, and to learn from others and share from our work, and to understand what works and doesn't work. And finally, nature-based solutions, as I said before, perform best when their multifunctionality is integrated with traditional infrastructure, and particularly in urban areas, where their benefits are aggregated and balanced across the landscape. And that requires us to work in much more joined up ways and working together to maximize their value. And for example, what do water quality and flood resilience have in common with recreational value of rivers, with resilient society and economy? In the context of nature, these are all interconnected, so we must avoid the silo decisions we're still seeing, which are falling short of driving the scale of recovery we absolutely need to deliver. We also need to consider this integration when it comes to looking at investment opportunities and blended finance, but also when it comes to delivering large-scale implementation. By connecting the dots across what I call the value chain of nature-based solutions, we can help to accelerate action, amplify best practice, and mainstream these solutions, so that they can continue to play a key role in driving the scale of transformation that will help to make our landscapes more resilient for the future, and therefore deliver the best possible value for water, nature, and people. So that's the end of my presentation. And we've got questions for the audience. Becca, you've got the poll exercise as well. But basically what we'd like to know from you are three things. Based on what you've heard from the presentation, based on your views and experiences and perspectives, what do you think are the top 3 barriers to implementation of nature-based solutions at scale? What's the problem that we really need to gang up on? And you've got some multiple choices options in there, but then kind of flipping this on its head, what are the enables that you think can make a significant change? And again, multiple choices now based on what I've presented. But what else are we missing potentially? So The third question is about completing the following sentence. If you had to choose one thing around all these things that we could possibly do to accelerate pace and scale of adoption of nature-based solutions, what would that one thing be? Thank you.
So I'm going to launch the polls and just take it one question at a time. So if we start with that barrier question, you'll see that it is a multiple choice question. So what we'd like everyone to do is just to pick their top 3, and we'll see whether there are any clear front runners in the sense, or whether it's actually very different, maybe based on different people's perspectives. And we'll give that 30 seconds or so. Hopefully most people will get the chance to submit their answers. Maybe just another 10 seconds, still quite a few responses coming in. Okay, it seems to be slowing down slightly, so I'm just going to give it another 10 seconds before ending it, and then I'll be able to share the results with everyone.
I'm very curious about this.
Okay, that's been a minute and a half, so I'm going to end it and then show the results and see whether it's what you expected or not, Amina.
Yeah, there's good distribution across most of them, isn't there? But I think shouting out is uncertainty around implementation, effectiveness and performance of nature-based solutions, but also things like limited funding. It's a no surprise, and lack of supportive policy and regulation. I'm pleased to say that this is in accordance with a lot of studies and case studies across not just the UK, but the world really, that shows that these 3 are actually the top 3 that most people will rank.
Yeah, and also kind of nice to see that lack of widespread awareness didn't come up too highly, at least amongst this audience. So yeah, we've got that first barrier. Yeah, okie dokie. Let's go with the next one. Just get that ready. So yeah, what enablers can make a significant change? And once again, it's a multiple choice question, so please select your top 3, or maybe fewer if you really don't think that you can select 3, and we'll see how we get on. I can see that straight away a couple of answers went to the top and they have stayed there ever since. So this is interesting. About half of you have answered so far. So once again, I'll give it another 30 seconds or so. Just make sure to get your answers in. Okay, just another 10 seconds. All right, then let's stop there and share those results.
So partnerships and more inclusive collaboration, financial mechanisms and regulatory incentives really scoring up high, which I guess in many ways are the enablers to the barriers that people scored really high as well, but also that joined up resourcing, planning and delivery and knowledge sharing So this is really good to see. Again, there's agreement with other studies and other sort of feedback from different stakeholders, which is good. So we're identifying and working on the right issues, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. So just give me 1 minute and I will take us to our final question, which in a first for us is a fill in the blank question. So hopefully this works okay for people. But yeah, if I had to choose one thing that could accelerate the pace and scale of adoption of nature-based solutions, that would be, and I suspect this may take slightly longer, just because you're going to have to think of the words without being prompted by us. So we'll give it a couple of minutes. Also, in the meantime, we will have a minute or two just for any last minute questions for Amina before we go to our break. So if you do have any burning questions, make sure to submit those via the Q&A as well. And I can see that the answers are starting to come in, which is good. We'll give it a couple of minutes. Just to say, I can see the one question that's come in so far from Mark is pointing to the agricultural sector. He says, what are your views on the issue that the agricultural sector often raise around reducing outputs from their sites linked to food security and competing demand from other non-farm uses for their land? Amina, obviously feel free to comment on that, but I would also say that the session that we have after the break on working with farmers and landowners will definitely be offering some answers to that as well.
Yeah, I think it's save that one, Mark, for that session. But I would say, how do we start to work with farmers around regenerative agriculture, and particularly looking at when thinking of nature-based solutions and the competing pressures with food security? How do you start to think about aggregation of some of these nature-based solutions or public goods benefits? And definitely something that we're exploring is how do we make sure that the two are harmonized and not really competing with each other? So we are starting to work with a lot of farmers, particularly through some of the market-led approaches around water stewardship, but also regen ag and other approaches as well. So yeah, it'll be an interesting discussion, I would say, after the break, Becca, where this will be definitely on the agenda.
Yeah, and we talk about working with farmers and landowners, but quite a lot of the staff across our movement are farmers themselves, aren't they? Whether that's part-time, and I think some of those are also in the audience today. So I'm sure that will be another lively discussion after the break, when we've all had some more refreshment, of course, to power us through the last part of the day. It's been a couple of minutes, so I'll just let the clock tick over to 3 minutes before ending that poll. I suspect it won't be as easy to share the results for that one with the group, but we'll do our best, or at the very least I'll be able to see them so I can see if any common themes occur. So let's end the poll now.
Word cloud thing in the background, that would be great.
Yeah, well, if it doesn't do it automatically, we can maybe create that after the day. So I'm going to end that now. Apologies if you didn't get your answer in, but maybe we can look at that in the chat another time. Let's have a look. Okay, so there's some quite long answers here. I don't know if anyone else can see them. If not, I apologise. Lots of stuff on funding, probably not surprising. Yeah, investment, looking at cost benefits, joined up planning and delivery. Obviously, we would definitely agree with that, wouldn't we? Regulatory incentives. Yep. Yeah, lots to think about there. Amina, can you see those results?
No.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, I think
okay.
if we
worth maybe creating a word cloud out of the answers we're getting, if we can, after this session, and maybe sharing that.
Or I guess we'll pull a report. People have given slightly more than single word answers, but it shows good engagement with the question. So thanks everyone for your participation in that. I can just see one more Q&A question. Oh, sorry, that was the one that I read out earlier. So I guess that probably brings our session to a close, unless you had any concluding comments, Amina.
No, thank you very much for your engagement with this and for the really hopefully exciting answers, particularly to question 3.
Yeah, I think that is a lot of exciting stuff is happening, and you're really at the heart of that, Amina, as well. In the Rivers Trust movement, some really transformative work happening, award-winning work, and we're excited to hear more about that after the break. Okay, welcome back everyone. Hope you are feeling refreshed and motivated for the final session of this first day of our conference. I think the first half of the afternoon has set us up really well for what's to come. Amina's presentation on our ambition for nature-based solutions has really kind of set us up with a nice call to action, but what's the next piece in the puzzle? Where do we want to put all of these lovely nature-based interventions on the land, of course? So that does bring us to our panel discussion on the role of farmers and landowners in all of this, which is absolutely crucial to our work as a Rivers Trust movement. So I'm going to hand over to Anna Gehring, who's one of our regional development managers here, to chair this session. Thanks, Anna.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to chair this panel discussion on the role of farmers and landowners in today's session on nature-based solutions at a catchment scale. So I'm delighted to introduce our 3 panelists today. If you're able to turn your cameras on when you're ready, that would be great. We have Jenny Phelps from the Farming and Wildlife Group. Jenny has over 30 years experience of giving advice on farms, the last 10 years of which has been with Gloucestershire Farming and Wildlife Group. Jenny leads on many projects, including the Upper Thames catchment-based approach and payments for ecosystem services DEFRA pilots. And all the projects use the integrated local delivery methodology, which aims to value and incorporate the knowledge and needs of landowners, authorities and local communities into projects. We've also got Sam Kenyon. Sam farms at Llanlyn Farm on the River Elwy in North Wales. Llanlyn comprises of 85 acres of meadows and 60 acres of woodland with 2 kilometres of river running through the heart of the property. Very much a firm advocate for regenerative mixed approach to farming, working to enhance habitat with nature-based solutions, recognising it's key to healthy land, healthy produce and a more resilient farm business in the face of climate change. She's also started a crowd-funded kickstart a natural flood management project on her biggest field, so we might hear a bit more about that, and Sam, feel free to post links to that in the chat. And finally, we've got Richard Reynolds, who is the lead at the agriculture team at Anglian Water. They focus on working with farmers to learn and build the solutions of the future to deliver clean, potable water to communities across East Anglia. So without further ado, and feel free to add to that detail as we go, I'll kick off our first questions. And please to the audience, please do post questions into the Q&A and we'll look to get to as many of those towards the end of the session. But we'll kickstart with some of these. So, and this one will go to Sam first, and then we'll bring Jenny and Richard into that. So farm businesses have long been regarded as custodians of our environments, but with the current climate, biodiversity and water crises, we're seeing a push from government to farmers to integrate conservation into their businesses. Do you think this is fair, and are farmers receptive to changing their business models to support this?
Yeah, thank you. I think it's fair as long as the push is seen throughout the whole of the food industry. So a bit like nature-based solutions work best when they're throughout the whole catchment from the top to the bottom. I think we need to see a conservation mindset adopted through the whole food industry from the top, perhaps where the money is with supermarkets, and see that filter down to us on the land. It's, sorry, what was the, I'm a bit nervous, so excuse me. But yeah,
you're doing great, Sam. I think that's a really good point. Do you think there's anything that we can do collectively to support that transition of seeing that whole supply chain approach to
Yeah, I think we need to look at where the funding is. I think that came up in the last session, which I just caught the end of. So perhaps that's where I'm looking towards supermarkets and government. But yeah, I think as farmers, we want to leave the land more resilient for the next generation, but our hands are tied a bit in that we're facing these current issues because we've had to push to produce food cheaply. So there isn't much wiggle room financially to then implement changing a system to be more environmentally friendly, perhaps giving land over to buffer strips, offline storage in winter, say. We just need the funding. I hate that it all comes down to money, and education. I think we need to see more in our agri colleges, sort of pushing the benefits of nature-based solutions to making the farm businesses more resilient. I'd love to see younger farmers come through with a wider knowledge on the benefits that I'm experiencing through integrating more nature and a regenerative approach.
Yeah, all really, really interesting points there, Sam. Everything from education to money to scale to supply chains. Jenny, is there anything that you'd like to add further to that, or any points you'd like to pick up on and expand there?
Yes, thank you. I think there's some really good points made there. I think that the bit that I'd like to add really is that I think that farmers are the first people to recognise that the climate is changing, and there's so much learning now around agroecology and soil health and building organic matter to deliver multiple benefits, not only environmental benefits but also being able to produce our food much more sustainably. And I think a lot of conventional farmers now recognise that it is actually quite vulnerable, the conventional system, to not only to external input costs, but also to drought and obviously to flood if the landscape isn't managed collectively. So I think a lot of the farmers are actually really keen to start to look at regenerative agroecological practice, but the best way for them to be able to be supported by that is really much more to catchment and county and district level, because unfortunately our national schemes are based around income foregone and don't create the revenue payments. So looking at paying farmers for the ecosystem services of good agroecologically healthy soils, which underpins ecological recovery, would be a really good thing to do. So that's what we're trying to do in Gloucestershire.
Thanks, Jenny. Richard, is there anything you'd like to add from a water company perspective into that discussion?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that anybody has heard me talking before is one of the things I always say is that there's no such thing as a farmer. I think it's a complicated sector. There's old farmers and young farmers, very progressive farmers that want to be leading, very conservative farmers, and understanding the dynamics and what makes a difference to individual farms, certainly in the work that we've done, is the key. When somebody tries to roll out a system that is good for everybody, it's inevitably an average and it doesn't get those key bits. And it's why the importance of understanding those local details, those local dynamics. What is, often going to a local market is far better than trying to subdivide things at a artificial level, which unfortunately tends to come down. That's a simple administrative boundary, and therefore we'll do everything over there. And I think too many people try and find a kind of science-based things, and it is a lot of hearts and minds. There's a lot, a lot of these decisions are based on trust, and we've got to work on that. And maybe that's a criticism across everywhere is bring the people into these sort of decisions. What farmers are businesses, farmers as a small businesses across everywhere. The individual things that tie in that make it, it might make sense to somebody sitting outside. What are the nuances that are in there?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. That actually ties into the second question I was hoping to ask. So I might come straight back to you for this one. We've heard a lot around the need for landscape scale change, which obviously requires farmers and landowners and land managers to work together at these scales. But as you say, Richard, every farm is different, every farmer is different. So how easy is it for farmers to work together at these scales? Is there a role for farm clusters or facilitation groups to bring them together? Just be interested in your perspective, well, all of your perspectives on how easy it is to get to that landscape scale approach.
From my perspective, from where we've worked, we started working with individual farmers. In the Anglian region, there's 10,500 farmers. So realistically, I'm never going to get to see all of them. And the next way we're looking at the groups beyond where we've already got engagement is things like clusters of who are the people that are somewhere along that journey already. If you put it simply, that there's some people who are leading already that really there's no value that we can add there. There's some people that are very conservative and are not in a position to move. And it's kind of trying to choose the groups that are, where can we help them make the next step? You know, we're not going to be imposing anything, we can't, but sometimes we can come through, help with collaboration, help with facilitation. Ultimately, all of the work that we do is about shaping opinions and helping farmers to be able to make an informed decision for themselves. I think the world of we've decided something and we're going to oppose it across everywhere, if it was ever there, you know, that's certainly not for the kind of my world to tie into. And as a result, things like cluster groups in whatever name or whatever form, whatever group that's there is the way we're looking to. And a lot of it, you know, if there's a group that's there, I think the key thing is what do we need to do to keep that conversation going? What are the key things that's brought that group together, whether it be livestock, whether it be grazing, whether it be regen, and find something around that. So it's finding those existing interest groups and seeing what support they need. I think in some respects we try to apply one formula to all of them. Oh, we'll just do cluster groups everywhere. And my fear is that in the next couple of years, it's going to be well, how do we work with farmers? Well, cluster groups, we'll just do cluster groups with 50 farmers times 500, bang, we've solved the problem. And then it's just another imposed solution. It's what's the nuance, what are the things? And I think the benefit we have is that there are lots of really good groups that are starting to form here. And in some respects, from a water company perspective, it's coming knocking on the door and saying, well, what can we do to support? Sometimes there's nothing we can do. Sometimes there is. It's keeping that door open and not saying, well, there's only one solution there. I think it's keeping the eye on the long game of what do we, you know, to me, I want a resilient agricultural land management sector that blends food production, environmental services, everything in a kind of vibrant community. If you say it quickly, it's easy.
So sounds really easy. Yeah. Thanks, Richard. Jenny, I'd be really interested in your perspective on that, having worked with lots of farmers over that kind of landscape scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we started our farmer gardens, the Upper Thames, I think in 2016, and we ended up with sort of 102 farmers, over 25,000 hectares. And since then, you know, we've been sort of, that is a brilliant collective group for shared learning, for having a shared voice about farmers wanting to potentially, you know, really be offering the solutions that we want. They want to be part of the team, particularly in a climate emergency. So it's their land, and obviously, you know, we need to support them in our society to help deliver all the things we want farmland to deliver. We've ended up through our ELM phase 1, 2 and 3, our environmental land management schemes, actually to look at a much higher resolution. So we're now working at a water body level, looking about how communities can become resilient to climate change by working with much smaller groups of farmers along water bodies, where we look at every field parcel, we look at all the infrastructure, all the different strategic plans over those areas, all the opportunities for food provisioning, water provisioning, holding the land back, habitat restoration, connectivity, looking at socio-economic and environmental well-being, and actually creating multiple investment-ready projects where farmers in those areas can actually work together to actually see how they could deliver multiple societal benefits and ecosystem services for us and be rewarded for it. And I think that's the bit that's missing at the moment is that, you know, we want farmers to deliver all this stuff, but at the moment, you know, the economic value of water being held back to stop flooding, or the water quality, or the biodiversity recovery, or the carbon capture isn't monetarised for those farmers. And unfortunately, ELM has been designed as a national scheme, which is based on income forgotten. And that's actually not quantifying all of those amazing services in an economic value back to the revenue for the farmer. So what we're trying to do in Gloucestershire is be really innovative and say, well, if we did value all those services by doing some natural capital mapping and managing and across these water bodies the way that the farmers are managing this land, could we actually make food, fibre and fuel from those landscapes affordable for everyone, because we valued all those services economically that the land collectively is delivering. So it's really a huge opportunity for us, and those businesses will work individually, but they can have a shared vision of how to be supportive to their communities in a climate crisis across their locality. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. That's really interesting, the different scales that you still work at, even within those cluster groups. Sam, what would your view be of that from an individual farmer perspective, in terms of what you need and the support you need, the incentives you need to kind of work with fellow farmers at that landscape scale?
Well, first of all, I want to pick my farm up and move to Gloucestershire after listening to Jenny. So here in North Wales, our farms, there's like more farmers. We're smaller farms. So there's a lot of people to try and get on with in a smaller area. And that can present challenges in itself, but it can also be amazing as well when we all pull together and swim in the same direction. I would love to see that farmers who are doing something that's seen as a bit out there, like perhaps creating their own offline storage or moving fence lines back off of watercourses, I'd love to see us odd ones taken to other farms where there is a slight interest, someone's shown an interest in wanting to do something environmentally friendly, and where we can have such open discussions about maybe what I see could be done, what they know would or wouldn't work, and just talking amongst ourselves. But quite often the farmer in a meeting is the only one not getting paid, so it's really difficult. You know, we don't get a wage unless you're employed on the farm, but when you're the farmer, you're not getting paid, so it's really hard to take the time to go and speak to other farmers and have a mooch about and have that open conversation. And there's quite a lot of peer pressure as well. So like being here, I'm in the middle of the milk field of the Vale of Clwyd, and there's a lot of peer pressure to keep intensifying and not to do too much that's environmentally friendly. You're seen as a bit of a hippie. So I would really like to see like some sort of facilitation where we can come together small scale and then grow from that. I keep hearing about sort of projects or ideas to put big clusters together, and you're not all going to get along. There's going to be so many different ideas and opinions in that one room. I think we need to get out on farm a lot more in our smaller groups, and then we're all looking over each other's hedges. We're all having a look to see what works and what doesn't work and why they're doing it, and sort of letting others take a bit of the risk first. So it would be awesome if we can do more of that and just accept that it doesn't have to be some paperwork heavy big cluster group led thing, just small and local, and let that grow organically.
I think there's a really interesting perspectives, and we have the same thing in the charitable sector, Sam, whereby how do you pay for development costs of thinking about these projects? And that's a real barrier to getting some of these things off the ground, isn't it? You know, find a mechanism to pay for time while you're thinking about these things. It can help, can't it?
Yeah, sorry, I should have said in Stroud, I've heard of where farmers are paid to do some works as if they're the contractor, because we've all got public liability insurance, and I think like if someone was going to say they're going to pay me to hold some water back or to repair or to help pay a bit of a wage to help me repair a riverbank, I jump at the chance because I'm interested in doing it anyway. It's going to help the community downriver. It's going to help my land. And for once, I get a bit of a wage that might not be much, but we're used to that anyway. And it's like showing a bit of respect that we're doers and we can get on and work with solutions.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really nice segue actually into my kind of final question that I was hoping to ask. That Richard, I'll bring you in on this one. You can respond to that point as well. But my question was going to be around, you know, the water industry and the agriculture industry are commonly cited as the biggest polluters of rivers. So is there an opportunity to work more closely together through the catchment-based approach to facilitate some of these conversations, do you think? And feel free to pick up on the previous point.
I'll pick up Sam's point first and then reply to that. I absolutely agree with Sam. And one of the things we've moved away from is when we're doing farm trials and that sort of stuff, working out how much we're going to pay and those sort of things. To me, the most important thing in a trial or a piece of work there is farmer's time. So we've changed our trials to, essentially, I want the farmer's opinion. So we're paying for farmer's time rather than we'll pay you X amount per hectare and that sort of stuff, because it's the thought process. It's the, we tried this, we tried that, what made a difference? I want that conversation is where the real value is. It's having that time, it's valuing the farmer's time. And I'm thinking about just in terms of kind of trials where we've asked farmer to look at two different things. But whenever we cost those things up, it's about farmer's time. It's not about a rate per hectare and all those sort of things, because I think it undervalues the true value and that sort of stuff. So it's a slight parallel to what Sam's saying, but I think it's, sorry, I don't know why that, can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, suddenly it said unmute. Yeah, so it's trying to find ways of valuing that farmer input, breaking the kind of traditional approaches of price per hectare, price per acre, all of those sort of things there, and kind of saying, well, what's the true value in there? In terms of partnerships, I think a lot of it comes down to trust. That, you know, there are lots of examples of agriculture and the water sector disagreeing about things, but I think that almost forgets all the good work that has happened as well, where we have been able to work together to achieve things. Our approach at Anglian's very much changed to, instead of trying to teach farmers how to farm, where I think farmers are the experts, a lot of it's about saying, well, what is your plan in the next 3 to 5 years? What are the things that will make a difference getting to where you want to be? What are the things we can help with that sort of journey? So we're starting to do a lot more stuff in terms of, and our grants and those sort of things are targeted really around, how can we help you take those next steps? What are the things that hold you back? So the grants that we're doing, for example, second-hand kit, absolutely, crack it on. If you want to do an upgrade to an existing piece of equipment that you've got, I'm interested in the output at the far end. Why do you want to be doing it? So, and I think it's also breaking the molds from those, there's lots of people that will do traditional grant, catchment sensitive farming and those sort of things. One of the things we did this last year was a training grant, where we broadly, initially, I thought we were going to work with structured basis projects and all that sort of stuff. And in the end said, well, the team said, don't work it that way. We'll do up to 50% of any training course a farm wants to do, up to 500 quid. So relatively simple, easy to manage. And the range of different things that people wanted to go to, wanted to see, has been fascinating. And I think there's a big learning for my sector in terms of, we don't have all the solutions. We know where we want to go, but there's even in the Anglian region, 10,500 farmers with brilliant ideas. Let's put the means to achieve it. And for some people, yes, it might be a formal basis training course, but over 50% of the courses we funded there were way less than the £500, but were about soil health, soil management, regen farming, those sort of things. What were the things that farmers are doing? We want them to be putting some money in, and the next conversation we're going to be having is, what's the next steps we can do? So I think there is money there, but it's evolving it in a way that makes it easy for farmers to access, aren't helping the bits that the conventional, more old-fashioned structured systems don't have the flexibility to do. So that's kind of where we work, and that's where we're working with the likes of CABA and with any organizations that are out there. We're doing our best to do. So yeah, I'm going to mute for a while.
It's really great to hear that you're thinking about things in that more flexible, enabling way, Richard. So I hope you're sharing that with other water companies as well, because it sounds like a really good approach.
We do our best.
I'm keen to we've had lots of comments in the chat, all really great feedback, and we've got some questions in the Q&A, so I'd like to try and use the last 5 minutes or so to pull out some questions from the audience. So I'll start with a question from Mark Harris, who says, I'm no expert on framing payments, but looking at the latest English basic payment scheme, there appears to be a wide range of payments for nature-based non-farming interventions. Are these capable of delivering the right schemes to improve water quality? Jenny, what do you think about that?
I think I was actually wanting to answer a bit of the question 3 as well, so I might merge a bit of that together if that's okay. I mean, I think there are multiple different funding streams for nature-based solutions. I mean, that's what the catchment base has facilitated, is that opportunity for, you know, co-investment in nature-based solutions. And I don't think national government, unfortunately, you know, with the lost basic payment, is replacing that income, as I say, at a national level that farmers might need to do that. But there is lots of funding for capital works for nature-based solutions. I just wanted to make a point, if I may, about that question 3, because we did a 4-year project called the WILD project, the Water with Integrated Local Delivery project, around farmers working together with water companies on water quality, particularly around you know, looking at what was impacting on the rivers. And what we discovered is that the farmers can do an enormous amount, and they did, and they offered, you know, to restore their habitats, put in river buffers, do lots of habitat restoration, just like, you know, Sam has been saying how brilliantly she would do that. And actually, but what we learned was that the infrastructure, the human infrastructure across our catchments, is not fit for purpose, and that the farming knowledge and the community knowledge was able to signpost to where there's all the issues, where clean water is getting into water industry foul systems and causing this awful sewage surcharging that we don't want to go into those conversations because I know they were had this morning. But the point being that infrastructure, you can do all the nature-based solutions in the world, but if you've still got derelict infrastructure, and that's what the project showed, is the fact that if we can give our communities a data set, working with our water companies, of where this clean water is getting into our foul systems, and we could take the sewage and create community energy, as I've been talking about for a while, instead you take the horrible things out of the river and do something positive with it. Because the farmers showed in that 4-year project that they were really willing and happy and loved the rivers just as much as anybody else, you know, and actually all of the things that we asked them to adopt, they did. And so I think that, just to go back to the original question, is just, as I say, there is lots of funding out there. It needs facilitating because it's very complicated for farmers these days. There's so many different funding streams out there, but there is funding, but it's actually creating solutions that will work across the whole landscape and not just scratch the surface. We need to solve the problem of you know, dirty water in our rivers. Thank you.
I just wanted to add one thing that we never thought about before now, but looking at water quality as the measures of success are really important, because we saw this last year. A lot of farmers that were doing very good practice, but in a very dry year, we don't have any water to dilute things, so problems feel like they're worse than they are. And it's looking at that information, making sure we really know the questions, what we're trying to do, take a longer term vision, because if it's a rainy year, if it's a dry year, if you're just taking a sample out of the water, context is everything. And it's not just a simple thing, which is why, to me, tying in with farmers, what's your longer term, where's the journey, where are we going, it's to me a more resilient way that we've adapted things rather than just individual numbers. It's a bigger picture.
Yeah, it's a really, really important point around monitoring as well. I'm keen to squeeze in one last question from the audience, and I'm going to go with Simon's question at the end. And he talks around some challenges with NFM on trying to encourage farmers to host NFM interventions because their farms are on clay and they just want to get the water off their land as fast as possible. And his question is, how do we keep a conversation going with farmers without stepping into telling them what to do? Would welcome any tips from the panel. So Sam, can I come to you on that first? Thank you.
Yeah, don't tell us what to do. It's hard enough working 70 to 80 hours a week, especially if you're in dairy, without taking much of a wage. So yeah, for myself, I could be grumpy quickly enough. I think it's asking what we could do, or if we were perhaps reimbursed, or if there was a way of helping us to save costs in the long run for our farm businesses. What would we like to see? What would we perhaps consider? So one of my other jobs is milk recording, and just talking to one of my dairy farmers and talking about something that mattered to him in his heart, was talking about his trees that his granddad planted, which are now obviously a woodland, and just talking to him gave him the idea that he could also plant some trees. He's now a granddad. So that another milk recorder in so many years' time can be having that same conversation with his grandson. And anyway, long story short, he sent me off with some money and I bought 50 oak trees, and he's put them on the side of he calls it a river, it's not, it's a stream. So there he's creating a bit more of a buffer. So I think we need to sort of tap in, it's the hearts and minds things, it's the conversation that both Jenny and Richard have been talking about, it's opening that dialogue, and then also just earning a bit of respect from us, maybe, in a way. Someone put in the chat about, you know, we really respect advisors for what they know about maybe species and what they can tell us about different plant species, and then what fauna that flora links to. So it's just, instead of having this sort of like, I'm going to come in and tell you what you should do, let's come in and have a conversation about maybe something you'd like to do. I can tell you why it wouldn't work, I can tell you why it would work, and it could be amazing, and it could be benefiting your business for you and your kids. It's having those conversations rather than being dictated to.
Thanks, Sam. Really critical point. I think we're up to time. Jenny, Richard, do you have anything, last thoughts that you want to throw in on that?
I'd just like to say that, you know, we always respect the person that we meet. I mean, I volunteer for a farming help charity. We go down the farm gate to see how we can help, you know, what's going on in somebody's life, and can we be useful? I mean, that's the mantra in our team is, you know, can we help that person's business? Can we help the land be resilient, the business be resilient, and the person be resilient? And that's really, you know, as Sam says, if you go with respect to the person you meet and find out what's going on in their lives and whether there could be something positive you can do to help with that, then you're normally well received. So thank you, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Sam. That's been a really fascinating, lively discussion, and thank you to everyone in the audience who's posted questions. Apologies we couldn't get to them all in the half hour we've had. So Becca, I think it's time to pass back to you.
Yes, I'll just come in really quickly. That was fantastic. I think we maybe even had more engagement there than earlier when we were talking about sewage. So I'm sure that panelists will be really happy about that. I am going to hand over, without stealing any more of the limelight, to Dan Turner, who's a technical lead on our team at the Rivers Trust and knows loads about all of this kind of stuff. So he's going to tie all those threads of the afternoon together and talk us through one of our case studies as well. So thank you, Dan. You are good to go.
Thanks all. I'll just load up my, let's go into full screen. How do we do this? Can people see that?
It's not quite on full screen yet. Maybe it's loading.
Let's have a look. So I should know this after how many ever years of working on Zoom. Can we see that?
Excellent. Yeah.
Brilliant.
Good to go.
So I'm Dan Turner, technical lead for land management and environmental markets. And today it's a pleasure to be presenting on the Resilient Glenderamackin project, which is a partnership between West Cumbria Rivers Trust, Nature Finance and the Rivers Trust, with funding from the Environment Agency and Natural Course. And this project is looking at mechanisms to accelerate nature recovery through blending private and public funds. And this project is focusing very much on natural flood management. So natural flood management, or more commonly referred to as NFM, is an approach of integrating the restoration of natural features and processes with existing land uses to store, hold, and intercept water to reduce flood risk to downstream communities. These nature-based solutions are really important to enable an integrated approach to flood risk in the UK, as we know that hard engineered flood risk solutions alone will not address our future flood risk challenges and must be supplemented with nature-based solutions. But the mechanisms to finance natural flood management still remain a significant barrier to uptake. So NFM is becoming quite a mainstream approach to tackling flood risk, and this was really driven forward after the 2015 floods, where there was a real desire to take a more proactive approach to flooding that delivered also on some of our wider benefits. Over the last few years, there has been a significant development in our kind of modelling capability to help us understand where NFM will be most effective in our landscapes. And there's also been some excellent examples of projects across the country and a wealth of experience built up in the delivery of NFM through various different programs. So I guess we are now at the point of how do we scale up the delivery and unlock some of those funding barriers? So that brings us nicely onto the Resilient Glenderamackin project, which is looking at scaling up the Wire NFM project, which we completed last year, and is an example of one of the first nature-based solutions ecosystem service marketplaces. So the Glenderamackin catchment is located in northwest of England on the edge of the Lake District. It drains from the Blencathra Hills before it moves downstream towards Keswick. Keswick has experienced regular and significant flooding, and in 2015, over 550 properties were affected. And like many of our upland catchments, there are also a lot of wider issues. The Glenderamackin is a SAC in unfavourable conditions. It suffers from a lack of biodiversity and is subject to poor water quality. So this project is all about tackling some of those issues through the delivery of an integrated nature-based solutions approach. The primary driver is reducing flood risk. So based on some targeted hydrological modelling, the project looks like it could reduce peak flow by 5% in a 1 in 30 year flood event, which would take 55 residential properties and 47 business properties out of a band of flood risk. But there's also many other secondary benefits, including improved water quality, carbon sequestration, habitat creation, and also some of those socioeconomic benefits as well. And this is very importantly working with a number of farmers in that catchment as well. So these are some of the planned interventions, and they are all very well known NFM techniques, which are tried and tested, and which we have been delivering for a number of years. So these include things like earth bunds or bunded hedges to hold water, re-wetting peat in some of our upland areas, ponds, wetlands and scrapes, leaky dams or large woody debris, tree planting and river restoration. And West Cumbria Rivers Trust have been delivering NFM for a number of years in the catchment, and as a result have built up very good relationships with farmers in the catchment who are now open to doing more. And previous schemes have been funded through grant and aid, which has covered the kind of capital cost of delivery. But one of the main challenges to scaling up this approach is how do we create revenue streams for farmers through the payments for public goods, and how do we fund long-term maintenance of these natural assets, just like how we would look after some of our grey infrastructure assets. So, bit of a recap, what we're trying to do in this project. So we're looking at reducing peak flow by 5% in a 1 in 30 year flood event. This is based on some detailed hydrological modelling, and we're looking to store around 900,000 metres cubed of water in that upper catchment. It's going to deliver on lots of other wider benefits, so increasing biodiversity, storing carbon, improving water quality, and ultimately creating a more resilient catchment that can respond to the pressures of climate change and our future flood risk challenges. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're looking at developing an innovative blended finance mechanism in line with the goals of the 25-year environment plan. And this, through our financial modelling, this looks like we're going to need around £8 million, and we're going to have to, would like to enter into long-term contracts with farmers and landowners for hosting those interventions on the ground. So, how are we going to do this? And how are we going to fund this project? So the real challenge in this project is how do we bring together all the various stakeholders through an ecosystem service revenue model? So in this case, we're taking lessons learned from the Wire NFM project, which was successfully delivered last year and is actively a company at the moment. We'll take a kind of debt-based approach, which is looking at securing green investment from investors that can be repaid over several years by a range of organisations which will benefit from the flood risk reduction and the other benefits that the project will deliver. This kind of model here can seem quite complex at first view, but I like to think of it just like any other startup business, essentially, which needs to raise some investment to get going, and the product we happen to be selling is ecosystem services. So this is a simple transactional structure. At the heart, we have something called a special purpose vehicle, which will draw down external investment finance to fund the capital delivery, which will then be repaid over a 12-year period through contracts with buyers, so those that will benefit from the intervention. So either that being through reduced flood risk or meeting water stewardship goals, or the removal of nutrients in the system, and sellers, so farmers and landowners, will host the NFM interventions on the ground. But essentially, this is a social enterprise model. The SPV will be set up as a community interest company, limited by guarantee, which will have an asset lock on it. So that basically means that if there is any retained profit in this SPV, that will go towards further catchment interventions. And it's really important also to kind of recognise that this will probably be governed by a board of voluntary directors, and they'll all represent different stakeholders in this catchment. So the farmers, the buyers, the delivery partners, investors will all come together to collectively solve an issue, and will all have a buy-in to the project. So what we're trying to achieve here is a locally owned project that is a win-win-win for all involved. And we can only achieve that through collaboration and co-design. And I thought it'd also be worth clarifying on a point, and a question that we often get asked is, why do we need debt or a loan to get going? Well, debt or risk capital is really a way of managing risk. We operate in this sector as quite risk averse, and many are uncertain of the benefits of nature-based solutions, and that was highlighted earlier as one of those barriers. So by using debt, we can actually start removing some of that risk, and the buyers of ecosystem services can enter into performance-based contracts and only pay for the services when they are delivering. So it is just to highlight, this is really a way of managing some risk. So the main benefit, as I said, we're focused on flood risk reduction. However, we know that the interventions will also deliver wider benefits to other stakeholders. So, for example, ponds will also have permanent water storage, which could have a replenish value, and meeting businesses' water stewardship goals. The Glenderamackin, as I said before, is a SAC. Therefore, there might be an opportunity to monetize some of the nutrient removal from the interventions that are being delivered. And we'll also explore the possibility of carbon and biodiversity net gain as another revenue stream for farmers and landowners. So this is just a very quick visual representation of some of the interventions we are looking to deliver, and the amount of kind of storage they could generate. So what are the next steps? So here we have the kind of 5 main work streams that we are working on to basically get to what we call investment readiness, in which we have a robust business plan and a financial model behind it. So we've gone through a lot of the service and optioneering approaches to understand what we'd like to deliver in the catchment and what are those other benefits it could deliver on. We've engaged with a number of buyers and having regular meetings to bring buyers of ecosystem services together through a collaborative approach. sellers, we've done some really interesting work with the sellers. I think we've utilised a facilitation group in this catchment as a mechanism to do that, and we're really trying to get a level of co-design with those farmers. So Claire at the West Cumbria Rivers Trust had lots of meetings with farmers, and they've actually brought together and actually starting to design what those payments look like and what the contracts could look like. And for instance, in the wire example, picking up on Sam's earlier comment, we actually paid the farmers £500 onboarding fee, recognising that actually they spent a lot of time helping us design this project. There's also a governance, which we've taken lots of lessons learned from the wire, but looking at things like establishing that entity, that new entity, and who might be some of the directors on that board. And finally, we also build a financial model behind this, which underpins us and gives that security over a long period of time. But if you're interested in these kind of projects and the steps that you might need to go through to get to investment readiness, the Green Finance Institute have put together a really, really useful toolkit, and I put a link there below. So yeah, I appreciate that's been a fairly swift run through of this project, and it's a fairly complex project, but if there is an opportunity, and I'm more than happy to take any more questions, but I've also put another link here from a case study on the wire project if anybody's interested. So hopefully that was useful, and happy to take some questions if there's an opportunity.
Thanks, Dan. Just maybe while anyone does start posting their questions, unless you just covered everything so comprehensively that everyone is fully informed as much as they possibly can be. Yeah, thanks for that presentation. It's really exciting to see what's happening in Glenderamackin and following the sort of first innovative footsteps of your other projects as well. Here's a question come in from Tom. So he said, what were the main learnings and improvements from the wire project? If you can answer that one.
That is a very good question. Yeah, so the wire NFM project actually completed last year, and we raised the first investment last year. So we're in very much the first stage of delivery. The Wire Rivers Trust out there, got a 3-year cycle of delivering the NFM on the ground. I think the lessons learned from the wire project is, you know, we definitely need more co-design with the farmers as well. You know, they're a fundamental part of this, these projects. Also, how do we kind of attract more kind of private finance into this? So, you know, especially from kind of corporates, supermarkets, supply chain, etc. How do we bring them into this? And we definitely want to try and operate in that business risk avoidance, not necessarily offsetting. So how can we actually use these projects to reduce business risks rather than, say, carbon offsetting?
Yeah, which actually links to what some people, not necessarily here today, but it has been mentioned in the past. There is maybe not a misconception, but there's a concern maybe for some people that this just leads to a simple monetization of nature in the environment. But I know that you're really keen to make sure that doesn't happen, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you know, and I think the main driver behind these projects is what those catchments, what those landscape needs, and we need to make sure that we, you know, that holds true throughout what we're doing, and that is the driver for change. And also we need to make sure that we bring local communities on along the journey with us, make sure that, you know, these are projects that are locally owned and tackling local issues. But I also, you know, answer to that question as well, I also often refer to it as it's not monetizing nature, it's monetizing the recovery of nature and accelerating nature recovery at the scale and pace that we, you know, really is required.
Absolutely, thank you. Another question here just saying, thanks Dan, out of interest, what would happen if the intervention don't quite deliver what the buyers have been sold? How would that original debt be repaid? Is it covered through insurance? That's a really interesting question, actually.
Yeah, really good question. Yeah, so that is basically the role of risk capital. So we have a series of different kind of performance metrics at different years, and if that is not met, then the investors are actually, you know, they risk losing some of their capital or repayments. So that is what I was saying before, is that's how we're managing risk essentially. So they all those investors had their own due diligence consultant, looked at our business plan and made that judgment, and therefore that kind of what set the interest rates. So yeah, I think as we get more confidence around MBS, there might not be as much need for debt base, but at this current time, it's become an enabler to accelerate.
Yeah, and it all comes back to that scale that we've talked about quite a lot. Like the more places that we can bring in these kinds of interventions, the more we'll learn from it. There's one final question from Tina in the Q&A, and Tina said, "What can we?" I presume she means, "What can we do to help you succeed?" Tina, if you let us know where you're coming from, what type, like where you work or whatever, then maybe that will help to answer that question. But otherwise, I think Dan's just got a few short remarks just to close out the day. If you want to go straight into that, Dan.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think it's been an absolutely brilliant session and some really interesting talks and discussion. Professor Bentley did a fantastic job of opening the session and giving us a really good insight into the impacts of our changing climate, weather patterns, and the real impact it's already having in the UK. There's some great visualizations of data, but also some pretty stark figures in there. The following panel discussion really highlighted the widespread impact this could have on hydrological response of our catchments and rivers, both in terms of floods and droughts. But I thought there was some really valuable insight into what we could do as a society to prepare and adapt. But to tackle our future challenges, it's going to really require a joined up, integrated approach. Amina went on to emphasize this and really rightly said that there are too many problems to be solved separately, and addressing them effectively requires new and collaborative ways of working. She demonstrated that nature-based solutions can play a critical role in addressing some of these issues while also tackling some of our wider societal challenges. However, there are many barriers to the delivery of MBS at scale and the pace that's required. And it was really interesting to see what the audience thought the main barrier to MBS was, which was policy and regulation, which ironically should be an enabler, not a barrier. We then had some really insightful discussions around the role of farmers and agriculture, some of the many challenges that they face as a sector, and recognizing that each farm is different, but we also have a lot to learn from farmers, and they often have some of the answers to our problems. And that very much aligns with my mantra that farmers are often the solution, not the problem. Then we heard a bit from me about innovative solutions to bring private funding to help accelerate nature-based solutions, very much with the emphasis of taking a local approach to tackle local issues. So to summarize, I think collectively, I think we need to think creatively, but personally, I feel as a sector, we need to get a bit more comfortable with risk and take a no regrets approach where we can, because ultimately the risk of not doing anything is far greater than doing something and getting it a little bit wrong. But what came out loud and clear to me, as a sector, we need to collectively come together to find solutions, break down those barriers and find common and joined up approaches that are integrated and fundamentally accelerate nature recovery at the scale and pace that's required to meet our future challenges.
Very well put. Thanks, Dan. And I know that you brought that together very well and very quickly. So thanks so much for all of that. That brings our first day of the conference to a close. A massive thank you to everyone who's contributed so far and for all your help. It's been a really insightful day, really lively. very, very good discussions in the chat. Loads of you are posting your questions, and we are saving all those. So even if your question wasn't answered today, we have got it and we will review it, and where possible we can follow up on those as well. Just to signpost, I guess, the rest of the conference, something I'd like to say, we refer to ourselves a lot as a wet feet organisation. And a lot of the work that we've been talking about, particularly this afternoon, is really carried out on a local level by our member trusts. We've got more than 60 member trusts across the United Kingdom, Northern Ireland and Ireland as well. And although you haven't necessarily heard from many of them today, we do have several representatives from our members trusts speaking tomorrow, and so I just wanted to make sure that they get a shout out on the first day of the conference as well as the second. Finally, well, not finally, another thing, Dan referred to thinking creatively, and I think that's really important as well, no matter what area of the environment sector or any other sector we are working in. And that is also a nice little hint towards some of what we've got coming up tomorrow in our afternoon session on community buy-in and partnerships. We are going to have some creative interventions there, which I'm very much looking forward to, and I hope that you'll be able to join us for those as well.